Greetings, everyone from the East Coast and to the many time zones who are logging into this event. We welcome you as we do a deep dive into the topic of European Union UDI and legacy devices. This is the category of devices that, if they meet a specific criteria, can remain on the market for a period of time. I'm Angela Alexandro. I head up marketing here at ReTech Life Sciences. So our title today, what to know about EU UDI and legacy devices. A little bit about webinar logistics. The meeting is being recorded. Everyone is on mute. However, we do encourage questions, so submit those at any time in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. If you're having any technical difficulties, just send us a message in the chat box. And after the meeting, all registrants will receive a link to the slides and the video by email, and that'll probably be out in the next day or two. Our presenters today specialize in unique device identification and structured product labeling. John Lawrence, our Director of Product Management, he has advanced experience with machine-to-machine submission requirements to global UDI databases, including US FDA Good ID, UNIMED, and China NMPA. Also, Gary Sainer, our Senior Manager of Information Solutions at ReTech, a subject matter expert on UDI and other structured content reporting that is submitted to regulatory agencies and commercial organizations. And before we discuss some details of legacy devices in today's session, we turn over to the agenda slide. We want to make sure we all understand the scope of the particular EU devices under discussion. The EU Medical Device Regulation and in vitro diagnostic regulation cover many topics, institute numerous rules for multiple categories of devices. We're going to start the first section with John. Can you start us off with a high-level review of the categories of EU devices and focus in on what is meant by a legacy device?
Okay, no problem. So with the devices that we're talking about here, as you become familiar with the MDR and IVDR, you become aware that there's multiple buckets your product portfolio could fall into. First, there's the MDD, AIMDD, IVDD devices, the directive devices, essentially, the ones that be discontinued as of the date of application. The second category, which is going to be the category we're concentrating on today, is the legacy device, the legacy directive devices. So those are the directive devices continue to be placed on the market past the IMDR. You have opportunity for them to stay on the market meeting certain criteria. And then last is the MDR, IVDR compliant devices, so fully compliant with the regulation directive. If we see here, moving on to the timeline, if you place these buckets on a timeline, you'll see the medical device directive going up until, excuse me here, sorry.
Gary, you want to pick up this slide?
Yeah, it looks like John might have lost video or audio connection here. So, John, if you can still hear me, I'm going to jump in and cover this particular slide, then we'll see if we can't reconnect. But as John mentioned, the three buckets, if we put them into a little timeline, those directive medical devices that you elect not to put on the market after the date of application would stop as of May 26th. So this is already done. This is a couple months in the past. You've elected not to conclude to continue to place those on the market, and there's various reasons, economic reasons. You didn't want to go through the rigors of moving those into a medical device product. Maybe they had low profile, low volume, low profitability, whatever. So a lot of reasons. But the major bucket then that we were going to discuss today are these legacy devices. They have a directive certificate and they continue to be placed on the market. There's opportunity to go out to May 2024 with those. There are some criteria. that they have to meet. We'll discuss that. And then you can also take a device and have it in this medical device regulation category, where once you have it reviewed and meet all the constraints and the requirements of an MDR, then you can put that on the marketplace. So that's the three buckets that John was referring to. There is a similar type of pattern of the three buckets, and this is like a parallel universe, if you will, for in vitro diagnostics. So the subtle difference in the timeline is that the date of application is 1 year later. So the directive IVDs go out to May of 2022, and then there's this 2-year window for a legacy IVD, and then obviously you can have your in vitro diagnostic meet the in vitro diagnostic regulation. So that's the timeline for this particular slide. John, I think we were going to move into the definition. I'm just do a check here if your audio is back on. I don't see anything there.
I think maybe we lost him.
Okay. All right. So, Angela, I think I'm just go ahead and
Yep.
move on and cover for John here. So the definition is very interesting with legacy devices. You can do a search inside the MDR regulation and the IVD regulation, and you'll never find legacy devices defined. They just don't have that term in that particular document. They just don't use the term. So to get the definition of legacy devices, we move over to some of the guidance documents, and there we find the term legacy devices defined as medical devices, active implantable medical devices, or in vitro diagnostics. So that's the scope. And then of all those particular possibilities, these particular devices are covered by a valid directive certificate. And noteworthy is that they continue to be placed on the market after the date of application. So there's a link there to that guidance document. And then the other supporting document, there's various ones, but the other Medical Device Coordination Group 2019-5 talks about the registration of legacy devices. And again, it reiterates these devices can continue to be placed on the market by virtue of an Article 120 in the MDR and Article 110 in the IVDR. So we need to touch on what those two articles bring out, because they have some qualifiers as to what the legacy device needs to meet before it's actually able to be placed on the market. So I think I mentioned earlier that it does have to have a valid directive certificate. So typically these are class 3, 2As and Bs, and the legacy 1 sterile and the 1 measuring functions. So they would have a certificate, but it does have to be valid. So there's expiration dates depending on when you last renewed these particular certificates. They might expire 1 month from now, or 2 months, or a year, or they may not be able to enjoy the full time period. So keep that in mind. It has to be a valid certificate. And then the particular device does have to continue to comply with directive requirements using a notified body that applied that certificate. So just a quick little note there, some notified bodies are going out of business. So you want to make sure that your notified body is still able to do that. There might be some special accommodation to switch a notified body, but you'll have to look into that. Just be aware that you do have to continue to interact with your notified body that supplied the certificate. And then the third one there is a particular topic that sparked a lot of conversation in industry. No significant changes affecting design, safety, or effectiveness that would need a revised certificate. So industry was very, there was a lot of churn, put it that way, very much in confusion about what is the definition of a significant change. So there was a medical device guidance document that recently came, well, about a year ago now, 2020-3, and this is about, I don't know, 12, 14 pages of a flow diagram that talks about the details of what a significant change is. And if it falls into that category, then, you know, obviously you no longer qualify, and you have to take that device and meet the MDR or IVDR. So that's a very good document to follow with. And then there's this fourth criteria, which is very interesting. During this transition period for your legacy device, there are some requirements that you need to follow that are defined in the MDR or IVDR. So those modules and procedures that relate to post-market surveillance, market surveillance, vigilance, and registration of economic operators and devices must be followed in place of the directive requirements. So it's kind of a little bit of a hybrid. You know, you're really putting the product out under with a directive certificate, but yet you're adhering to some of the guidelines in the MDR. Now, this brings up a question. What if UDI is not up and running, and I'm in this period of transition where I have this legacy device, and that's exactly where we are today. So we're past the date of application. Legacy devices are continually placed on the market, but UDI is not fully ready. So there's only one module out there right now. So this guidance document talks a little bit more about that detail. And basically the guideline is continue to use the corresponding directive provisions until UDI is ready. So just a couple notes here before we move on. Devices that do not meet the above criteria must follow the new MDR regulations and be evaluated to them. So that is quite a transition. So hopefully you're able to enjoy this transition period of time. The other note is that the legacy device category does not include self-certified class 1s. So this whole provision, legacy devices, was based on the fact that you had a directive certificate, not self-certified. So they fall into a different bucket. We'll touch again on this a little bit later, but your class 1 devices, now that it's after the date of application, they needed to be self-certified according to the MDR. So that's a couple months now in the past. So that is a real issue. And if you haven't done that, then you certainly want to move that to the top of your to-do list to make sure you have those class 1 devices self-certified. Now, we talked about some provisions under the MDR where you have to interact with the UDI, and just a quick wrap up of how a legacy device would interact, and other devices for that matter would interact with UDI. The first of 6 modules, the economic operator module, is already rolled out. You can voluntarily use that. We actually highly encourage you to log in and get your single reference number, SRN. There's a second wave of 2 additional modules, the UDI device module and the certificate module. They are now planned for September of this year, so just a couple months away. So that would be the second and third. And then there's the remaining 3 modules, the clinical investigations, vigilance, and market surveillance, that are planned. And the official date is that these would all be up and running, validate or pass the audit and be fully functional by May 26th. So we're looking forward to that notice. Now, John and others are connected to various associations, and we keep our ears open to various activities and timelines and roadmaps and so on. There appears to be a possible delay in the development of these 3 modules. So if that occurs, we need to take a look at the timeline here to see what the impact of that particular delay might be. So we have our 2 date of applications on the timeline, pretty straightforward. We expect this launch that UDI is fully functional on May 26th, and that triggers a 6-month delay of many of the provisions inside the MDR relating to UDI. But after that 6-month delay period expires, there is an 18-month mandatory period of registration. So that runs from November 2022 to May 2024. Now, there's many other provisions that are launched after that 6-month delay, but the one that we're talking about here is that registration period. The actor module, as we touched on, is already in place. We're looking forward to the next 2 modules, September. It looks like that's probably going to be met by the European Commission. And then we have these other 3 modules that are in the mix. No firm date, but so we put a little caution flag next to that particular event. Now, if those 3 modules are delayed, then that obviously will push back the announcement from the European Commission that the UDI is fully functional. And then triggered by that particular announcement, the registration period might move out as well. So these are kind of all pinned together. So if one moves, they all kind of move. The other thing I'll quickly mention is that this is a period of time for reporting, but in the event that your product has a serious incident, then you do have to report it very quickly. So almost immediately, 2, 10, or 15 days based on the severity. So I think that completes the first definition, Angela?
Yep. Thanks, Gary, for that review of legacy devices. And just an update on Mr. John Lawrence. Evidently, some big power trucks showed up in his front yard and took out his power. So we're not going to have him the rest of the hour, but we will carry forward. So now that we know the qualifications of a device to be considered a legacy, we should also touch on the benefits granted to legacy devices. We understand that most all manufacturers are exercising their ability to continue to place their legacy products on the EU market as before the MDR date of application. So Gary, the provisions, can you tell us about those that are associated with legacy devices, and what is the meaning of 1-year sell-off? That is a term we get asked about quite a bit.
Yeah, okay, very good. So one of the stipulations in provision inside the MDR is really not a provision, but a statement that makes it clear that directive certificates can no longer be issued after the date of application. So this happened a couple months ago for medical devices. Still a little bit out there for the IVDs, but that's very clear. So there's no ability to renew your old directive medical device certificate. So, but there are some benefits, and we already touched on the first one here. Continue to place the product on the market and put it into service. So that goes out to 2024 May, and allowing a 3-year window for MDR and a 2-year window for in vitro diagnostics. But you bring up this other question about what is the supply chain, this reference to a sell-off, the 1-year sell-off. So this is a year that is after the end of May 2024. So it goes out, 1 year later to May 2025. And basically that allows products to continue to be flushed through the supply chain. So this would apply to be anything that's out of the manufacturer's control. So the supply chain starting with the distributor, or maybe a healthcare warehouse or storage area. It's sitting on a shelf, and now you have up to a year to use that particular product on a patient. So after the year expires, though, now it's no longer able to be used. It either have to be scrapped or returned for a requalification, quote, remanufacture or something. But you do have the 1 year to clean out the inventory. So that's what the supply chain is all about. Now, there's 2 other provisions. A legacy device does not ever need to have UDI placed on the label. So whatever marking you already have on your legacy device under the directive can continue in place. Now, it just might be that you already have a valid UDI. So using the GS1 example, maybe it's a G10 that you particularly use, or in retail, it might be EAN or some other symbology that you use. But you don't have to add a UDI label to your legacy device. Current marking or identification is able to continue to be used. Then the last point here related to that is no requirement to apply a direct mark. So directly marking UDI on the legacy products does not have to be done either. So if we take a look at this on a graph, this timeline graph that we referred to earlier, what is new here under discussion, we already know about this 3-year window of transition, but the 1-year sell-off goes at the end and allows the sell-off to occur for 1 additional year. And then in parallel, you have this date of application for the in vitro diagnostic. So it has a similar type of presentation here with its own sell-off, and they coincide, by the way. So the deadlines coincide, and the sell-off time period coincides. The starting period 1 year. So that's the quick summary there for those particular topics.
Okay, great. Thanks for that explanation. So before we move on, some of you folks are entering questions. It's great. So enter those at any time in the chat box. As we heard, one of the requirements of a manufacturer is to report UDI and device information for their EU legacy products in the UDIMED UDI device registration module. So Gary, can you tell us about the registration timing requirements for a legacy device and how an equivalent regulation device may be involved in that registration activity?
Yeah, and this is where it starts to get a little bit messy, so bear with me. Slides might get a little cluttered here, but one of the first things that we need to do is talk about an equivalent device, just to understand what that is, because there's a reference to an equivalent device versus a legacy device in this timing discussion. So first of all, what is an equivalent device? So we have a product, and if you were to look at the physical product, it might, for all intents and purposes, it's the very same identical product. So the design is the same, the intended use, the function, efficacy, safety, everything is the same about this very same product. So you have a legacy product that you've been marketing for years, and now you have something called an equivalent product, the identical same product. But there's a very significant difference in some of these other characteristics. The legislation and evaluation that is done for a legacy devices use the long-standing directives. Your equivalent device is compliant to the MDR or IVDR. So that's a whole different set of standards, and you folks are very much aware of that. Most likely you touched on some of these technical documents and evidence of supporting the safety and so on for this particular device. It's a whole another level of investigation and evaluation for an equivalent device under the MDR versus the directive. So again, nothing is grandfathered in. You have to start with your full inventory and have it meet the regulations. Now, the registration is different. So for your legacy, you had this member state requirements and procedures, and we'll talk a little bit more about your now new registration requirement for a legacy device into UDIMED. But the equivalent device has to be registered in UDIMED. And then there's another subtle difference here with the labeling. So actual product label and packaging label, the equivalent device must meet MDR regulations, which require UDI, also a MD symbol or IVD symbol, and there's some requirements for warnings and so on. There's no such UDI requirement for the legacy device, as we touched on. So that's some subtle difference. Now, we also need to understand what is not an equivalent device. So if your product had a number of changes, significant changes that we alluded to earlier, and now it's a different model or different version than your legacy device, then you can no longer call that particular instance an equivalent device. So that is a brand new product that needs to be evaluated under the MDR. So an equivalent device, you can perhaps reuse a lot of your existing documentation. If you have a new device, now you have to consider what the new design change is. So and develop safety data and effectiveness data and functionality data for that particular change. So that's the subtle differences there. Now, we'll talk about the timing of registration. There's this voluntary registration. John initially mentioned, and I also covered some ability for you to voluntary register. So you can voluntary register a legacy device, no matter if you register your equivalent device or if it moves into a standalone new medical device under the MDR. You can always do a legacy device registration, and you can do that anytime prior to the end of that 18-month period. As to what you need to do under the regulation, so this is mandatory requirement. So either your legacy device or the equivalent MDR device, or both, if you so elect, must be registered in Unimed by the end of that registration period. So this is a deadline. It's a requirement, either one or the other, or both. Either your legacy device or the equivalent need to be registered by that particular date. Now, during the particular registration window that we referred to, that 18th month period, there's this other provision and requirement comes into play. So if there's a serious incident, field safety notice, or a field safety corrective action, if that occurs during that particular window, then you need to quickly respond. So again, with a serious incident, 2, 10, or 15 days, you need to report that particular incident and point back to the corresponding device. So you can either log that particular serious incident back to the legacy device or the equivalent MDR device. But one or the other basically immediately has to be registered inside the Unimed. So you have that deadline that you must meet, and then it might be spontaneously if you have a serious incident during that particular period of time. So if we look at this on a timeline, this might be a little bit more interesting how we play this out. So in the lower half of the screen, we see devices being placed on the market. And we'll talk about that first. So we have these directed medical devices that are discontinued as of the date of application. We have these class 1 devices, by the way, that were under a directive, and this is the self-certified products, these class 1s. So they should have already been self-certified going forward. That's a couple months ago, back in May. And now the legacy devices, which is a topic of the day here, we have those being placed on the market under directive. Now they're placed in this legacy transition period. They meet all the qualifications. But there is this concept for reporting something called a medical device equivalent device. So we talked about that being identical, but now it meets the qualifications of the MDR. What is significant is that MDR compliant device has a long future connected with it. There's no deadline for when it has to come off. Now, as long as the model and version are still the same, that can continue onward for years. Legacy devices, they have this deadline. There's a cliff here. You no longer can place these on the market. So one of your strategies would be to very early on have your legacy devices reviewed by your notified body, and get the document together and have that completed. You want some margin here before the May 2024 deadline. If you don't get that review done, then you can no longer market your legacy devices, and you can't yet market your new MDR equivalent device. So this is a very challenging, busy period of time where you take your full inventory perhaps and start to have it comply with MDR. So this is a huge amount of effort and activity here. Now, in the event you elect to add a new feature or you have that significant change that we talked about, then your legacy device could be evaluated as a brand new MDR device with that new model and version, So it would have a different identifier and so on. So that is the timeline there about how you can place product on the market and eventually transition your portfolio away from directive-based products to MDR-based products. Layered on at the top is basically this announcement that we talked about, that UniMed is now ready to receive this information. You can voluntarily report it in this period of time, starting September of this year out to November. And then here's that 18-month window where you would have to report your legacy or equivalent device into this period of time. And again, there's some strategies about, well, I'll start to report and register my legacy devices just so I'm prepared for any serious event. I want to decrease the risk. I want to continue to market product. And then before this deadline occurs, you want to either have your MDR equivalent or MDR device registered as well, so that you can continue to supply the product to the marketplace and meet the needs of the patient. Let's take a look at this. This is pretty much identical to what we saw earlier. That's our sell-off and the UniMed notice and this mandatory period. I added this particular slide just to show the summary of everything we talked about for legacy devices, for medical devices, and then in parallel we have this additional requirements for in vitro diagnostic. So those manufacturers in the audience that are in vitro diagnostic, here's your timing. Pattern is very similar. Date of application is 1 year later. So that's a quick summary of the registration. Angela, I think you have something up your sleeve here for the audience.
Yeah, this might be a good time to take a break. Thanks for the registration timing info. Let's do a couple of quick polls. And we appreciate your participation. So we're going to launch the first one. When does your organization plan to begin submitting production med device UDI and registration data to the UniMed UDI module? So if you would kindly vote, is that going to be the beginning of the voluntary period, fall, later in the voluntary period in 2022, in the middle, or just prior to the mandatory deadline, which will be in 2024? Okay, and we'll give it a second or two here. Thanks for voting. Appreciate it. It's interesting to see what the readout is here. All right. Looks like just about everybody's voted. And let's share the results. So it looks like lots of folks are going to get an early start or later in the voluntary period, about 13% in the middle, and only a few waiting until the end. Great. Another quick poll. All right, second one, which types of products are you submitting first to the UniMed UDI module in production? Is that your legacy directive devices, MDR devices, those MDR system or procedure packs, IVDR, or you don't know yet? Okay. Thanks for voting, everyone. All right, and then we'll share the results there. Okay, so about 50% legacy devices and 36% MDR devices. Okay, thanks so much for participating. All right, so Gary, well, I think we're moving on to registration details, and that's similar to regulation compliant devices, but the European Commission has established alternate identifiers and a dedicated data set for use by legacy devices. So in this last section, Gary, Can you discuss the registration details of legacy devices and how they differ from regulation compliant devices?
Yeah, that's a real good topic for us to kind of summarize this discussion, and we'll get into some of those details because legacy devices are handled slightly different, similar but slightly different than a regular MDR compliant device. So I'm going to start off with just recapping the regulation compliant practices and identifiers and how you use that, and then compare the legacy devices to those. So just a quick recap here, bear with me if you're already very familiar with this. When you report and register your MDR or IVDR device into UDIMED, into that UDI module, that second module, there is a two-level category or two-level report. There's actually two records that are sent. The one record is for the individual device, and we're all very much familiar with that. Certainly if you had any experience with the US FDA. So there's a record about the actual device and a number of characteristics. In addition to that, there's the concept of a basic UDI-DI, and this is a grouping identifier for medical devices, and it allows a number of devices, one to many, to be grouped together under this identifier. So there's this two-level hierarchy that is being in place, that is in place for MDRs, and the relationship is one basic UDI to many, one to n, basically individual devices. Now, if we were to take a look at how this lays out with actual portfolio that you might have, I'm going to use example here. Let's say my company manufactures forceps, so I create this buddy, and we'll look about how that's actually created. But basically that's your in the GS1 scenario, you have your company prefix followed by a unique identifier, which you make up, alphanumeric, and then two check digits at the end. So that's your basic UDI. We've had some other webinars and discussions on that particular construct. But inside that group, my company manufactures, well, not really, this is fictitious, but let's say the company manufactures plastic forceps. It has a device identifier, and it also has a couple packaging levels. So maybe I put 3 forceps in a pouch, put 2 pouches in a box, so I have this hierarchy, all connected to the single button. Let's say this company also manufactures stainless steel forceps. So it meets all the criteria of the grouping, and therefore I can use this very same buddy for this second product line, and it may or may not have packaging level. But I have a third product. It's a stainless steel forceps, and it has a locking feature on it. So I actually have a different model and version for that, and therefore it falls into this category. So you get the idea. You can put many of these products under this particular grouping. Now, when you come over to legacy devices, it's not quite so transparent. So the regulations, this legal framework does not enforce a basic UDI or a UDI on a legacy device. So you might actually have a UDI identifier on your product as coincidence or as good practice, but there's no legal ground for applying a basic UDI or a UDI to a particular legacy product. And yet there is a requirement in the regulations that indicate that legacy devices need to be identified. We talked about the need to reporting a serious incident into UDIMED and registering a product. So how does that happen if you can't use the basic UDI-DI? So the European Commission had a little bit of a conflict here about how they actually would identify UDIMED. So there is a guidance document that came out from the Medical Device Coordination Group 2019-5 that talked about this issue and how they were going to respond. So the concept was to, quote, adapt the UDIMED design to allow the registration of legacy devices. without using the basic UDI and DI. So the the way this actually occurred is they created 2 new identifiers, and these 2 new identifiers are strictly only for legacy devices, and they came up with the names UDI DI, which would be an alternative for a basic UDI, and UDI ID, which is the legacy equivalent of a UDI DI. Now, perhaps in retrospect, they should have used some little bit different names. There's a lot of similar sounding terms there, and not perhaps real obvious, but this is the names, and so be it. And that's what we're marching to. So one of the things that was that became apparent is that the relationship between the group UDI DI and the individual device UDI ID is 1-to-1, not 1-to-many that the regulation device is able to define and put their construct around and organization around. So this is very different than the basic UDI. So it's subtle, but quite different when you start to look at that product portfolio of that fictitious company that we were talking about. So now we'll go into some details about how this is actually created, but here's an example of a UDI DI. It has a B dash in the front end, and that's always going to be there, and an identifier, and that's my group for a plastic forceps. So again, that identifier and again, this is only inside the database and refer to any documentation where it needs to have the UDI DI identified and UDI ID identified. So this is not on the product, but for organization purposes inside UDI, we have this D dash in the front of my UDI and a B dash in front of the group. And again, there's some hierarchy, and they have various identifiers. Now, it's noteworthy that when you report your legacy device into UDI, you're not reporting the packages, so you're only reporting the actual individual basic device product itself. So this is, again, a nuance for an MDR device. You obviously report all those packaging levels. And then you move over to that stainless steel forceps that this company made, and it has an identifier at the basic product level, a D dash in front of it, and it has its own parent. So it's not a common parent with this plastic forceps. It's a different parent. It's a 1-to-1 parent. There's only one family member inside this particular family, and so this is only for stainless steel forceps and the one product. And so on with the other scenarios with the product with that stainless steel locking feature. So that again has one parent, and all these are different. So in this case, we had 3 different products. We had 3 different organizations and or hierarchies, if you will, and we end up with 3 different UDI DIs. So this DI for the plastic forceps is different than this for the stainless steel, and it's different for the third one, the locking. So let's take a look at how this kind of fleshes out, how you actually build this particular DI and ID identifiers. There's 2 major ways to construct that particular identifier. And if you have been using a valid UDI DI, by what I mean by that is that you're either using a GS1 definition or a HIBIC definition or an ICC BBA or an IFA. So those 4 particular issuing entities are valid under the MDR. And if you had been using that for your legacy device, you're in a good position. You can continue to use that identifier when you report this into UDI, and all you simply do is add a D hyphen as a prefix. And then for the model group, again, 1-to-1, you simply change that D dog to B boy. So now you have a B hyphen in front of the very same identifier. Now, there is a provision if you had not been using a valid UDI. So now the European Commission has suggested and recommends that you derive your UDIMED DI and ID based on the single reference number. So that's another good reason to start your registration early into that actor module and have that allocated to your company. So there's some characters there about how you take the SRN number, you put an identifier in place, and then you add 2 check characters. And again, it'll always have the D dash in the front and a B dash in the front for the group. Now there's some other details here. I'll let you kind of work through this as a homework slide as to how this is actually constructed. The algorithms that I referred to there for the check characters, there is a European Commission document about how that actually works and how you can generate those. There's this requirement of these identifiers being 25 max characters in length, and they will only differ by B and D. And you do have this other options for basing it on an SRN. So let's look at some samples to try to drill this home. Well, if you're using a UDI, a valid UDI, it's very straightforward. Those that are constructing that particular identifier, I'm using the GS1 as an example here, but the conversation is the same with HIVIC and so on. You use that existing standard construct, which is that indicator digit, followed by the company prefix, followed by your item reference number, and you have a check digit. So the check digit includes everything in gray, everything that you typically do. The check digit does not include the prefix in the calculation. So to create a UDIMED DI for the individual device, you put that D dash in the front end, and then the very same identifier is used for the group, but all you need to do is change the prefix to a B. And there's similar type of construct here based on an SRN. If you have an SRN, you'll have a 3-segment number for your company. Here it happens to be in Belgium, and the operator, manufacturer, and a number assigned to your company. You come up with this product ID, and then you run through the calculation to get a check characters, and then you put a D dash in the front. So I don't think this will be used too often, so I'm going to move on. And if you have questions on that, please get a hold of us. So what I'd like to do now is do a side-by-side comparison between what is in a regulation device and what is on a legacy device. So a regulation device for a model will, and on the label. So we're going to look at the label and what's reported into UDIMED. And there are differences. That's why I wanted to go here. So for a label, you are very familiar with this particular item. Again, GS1 example here, you have the parentheses 01, close parenthesis for the application identifier for a device. And a 14-digit G10. You might also have an EN 13-digit or a 12-digit UPC, but in any case, it's a valid UDI. You've been putting that on your label for years, so you're very familiar with that. So you apply that to your regulation device, but you never ever put the basic UDI on that label. When you go to report this information to UDIMED, the actual at the device level, you leave off the parentheses 01 prefix, you put the number in, but now you need to come up with this basic UDI construct, and again, company prefix followed by alphanumeric identifier and then a 2 check digit. Now, in comparison, let's take a look at how this would lay out for a legacy device. So the legacy device, let's say it's been using this identifier for years, and you're able to continue to use it in this transition period. It might actually be the same as your equivalent medical device. So these, in a sample here, they are the same. So that means that this is an equivalent device. If this was not an equivalent device, then you'd have a different, at a minimum, a different item reference number, and perhaps packaging and so on, and then certainly a different check digit. But in this example, you're very familiar with a legacy device and UDI. You never have to change that label and add a UDIMED ID. So that does not appear on the label. when you go to report that legacy device based on the timelines we talked about, you would need to, again, strip off that parentheses 01. Now you have the 14-digit value. But in this case, you put a prefix, a D dash prefix in front of that UDI. And then once you have that in place, you just simply change the D to a B, and you have this identifier. So this is quite different when you report this into UDI. I added a couple more bits of information here. When you report these records into UDI for registration purposes, the issuing entity in this particular example will be either GS1 as shown, or it could be HIPAA, ICC, BBA, or IFA. And the legislation field is going to be either the medical device regulation or the IVD regulation. Contrast that to the record that you put in place for the legacy device. Here, the issuing entity is this new standard. Basically, you put the issuing entity by default as UDI. So UDI will be used for the issuing entity for all legacy devices. And then you will point to one of the three different directives. So that is the difference in actual reporting. So if we were to kind of summarize the last couple of slides here, nothing new here on this particular bullet, but basically just a summary of the information. But what I wanted to touch on is the second bullet, is that you will have two separate records inside UDI, one for your legacy device if you submit it, or you will have a MDR based record. And they're not revisions one to another. You don't edit and make a change or an update to the one record. These are two separate records. Most of the attributes will be identical. So by default, they're all the same, except for the couple of things that we talk about. The issuing entity is different, the legislation is different, and the identifiers are different. So, and also the package fields, don't appear on the legacy devices. So there's at a minimum those particular changes, but all your other attributes, 109 or so attributes will be the same. And then there is this concept of linking a legacy record to an equivalent regulation record. So there's a field there that's set aside in the data set for that particular relationship. We think that a manufacturer will be entering that and building that relationship. There might be some provision for a UDI to actually do some automatic linking. So we'll have to see how that fleshes out. We haven't heard the final word from the European Commission on that. And then a quick comment about the certificate and market presence. So you can have a legacy device that is marketed and placed on the market under the directive certificate simultaneously with the equivalent regulation device that is now out on the market under the MDR certificate. So they can both appear on the market now, again, for a period of time. We're talking about, but you can no longer, go forward all the time with that. So just a real quick touch here on the actual data that is associated with these two levels, these two records. So this is a list of the attributes for a legacy UDI DI group. So this is identical. The data set is identical to a MDR or IVDR group, except for two, actually three here, three differences. So there's three particular characteristics that are not applicable for a legacy group. So there's a grand total of 33 total here, 36 for an MDR type compliant device. And then the last slide that we touch on here is the particular attributes for an individual device. So this is down considerably as to the number of attributes. So you see a lot of dots on this screen. These are particular attributes that are not included with a legacy UDI ID. So this is at the device level, and there's a total of 51 of these particular individual attributes for the device. Some of these are language specific, by the way, so you might have multiple instances if you have multiple language. Angela, I'm going to stop there. I think we have a little bit of time left for maybe a couple questions. Anything that came in that we want to touch on?
Yes, yes. Thanks, Gary. That was a really comprehensive summary of what to know about EU, UDI, and legacy devices. We do have quite a few questions. We will try to get to as many as possible. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you. And note that folks are asking about the materials. They will be sent in a day or so to everybody that registered. Let's see. Prioritizing. If you have many legacy devices, first question, should you prioritize registering legacy devices, or should you concentrate on getting your equivalent MDR devices certified and registered?
Yeah, I think that question refers back to that little transition timeline that we had up, where some companies are doing what they can inside the constructs. So I would think it's a good strategy to go ahead, emphasize getting your legacy devices registered. So there's a couple things there's some benefits there. One is, you understand the system, you're familiar with the data set, you're starting to work with it, and that information is readily available. So it's in your hands now. So you can start collecting and cleansing the data set. So you have that information. You might not have all your medical devices reviewed by your notified body, and now either an equivalent device or a new standalone MDR. I'd be surprised if your full inventory is in that category. Many of the people we talk to are just embarking on that particular task, and it's huge, pulling all the documentation together and scheduling your notified body and making sure that they have appropriate personnel and staff to review it, and then going through it. So, this is not a 1 week activity, this is months. So I would highly recommend that you start first and getting the information on your legacy devices in place. So a couple things happen is you have some benefits of learning the data set, and you decrease the risk of taking care of this workload as you go through the timeline. Then I would recommend, as these particular devices have equivalent devices, these legacy devices now have an equivalent device or a standalone, that you then transition to provide more and more of those records in place of, now I'm talking about a medical equivalent device. So if I had an equivalent device that is now passed and qualified under MDR, then I can go ahead and register that device. That would preclude me from submitting my legacy device. So I would do a transition, start very early with the legacy devices and move down that path, but then in parallel, as the MDR compliant devices are available and fully validated and with a certificate, then I would start submitting those. So I see a two-phase and a transition, and that transition period, how aggressive you are on that is your business decision to decrease the risk of making sure you don't have a gap in the delivery. That's the last thing you want to have, is a gap in your delivery to the marketplace. Angela, you want to have another one?
Yeah, just one more question about the UDMed UDI playground environment. Will it accept legacy device UDI data now for testing? Yeah,
I believe that's true. I wish John was here to help answer that particular question, so maybe we'll put it in the response if I have it wrong here. But the information is defined in the data dictionary. So the data dictionary covers medical devices and IVD devices and legacy devices as well. So you have these definitions in place. I know John's been leading up the submission process and the testing. And I believe the Playbox is able to accept legacy devices, but we'll let you know otherwise.
Terrific. Before we close, we want to let you know that LexisNexis ReTech is very appreciative of your attendance, your interest. We want to help you meet your UDI and device registration requirements to the EU and other health authorities around the world. We do provide numerous free online resources for you to access So just browse to our website, readtech.com, select resources, knowledge center, and UDI. You can also connect via LinkedIn or Twitter, and we're always welcoming one-on-one by email, so get in touch with us at meddevice@readtech.com, or give us a phone call, and again, we will be in touch over email. Thank you, stay safe. Thanks to Gary for all the information you provided. Goodbye, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye now.